It is February, which means it's Black History Month. And for this month, we're theming our videos on Black History Month and on the books that we read that can sort of educate us a little bit more. Neither of us are Black, obviously. And of course, that means that the way that we consume literature and the way that we consume like Black culture is always going to be a little bit fraught and a little bit harder to consciously do well, and without being condescending and trying to think that we know it all about the state of Black literature in America. We still want to sort of share out things that we've learned over time and things that we're looking to learn more about, as diversity and representation gets a little bit more prevalent. My name's Rosie, and I'm the children's buyer and various other roles at Raiders Books in Sonoma, California. We're a small, independent, new and used bookstore, which has tried over the years to really live up to our motto, which is a gathering place for readers of all ages. Um, and I think what we could have done, except it would get a little bit mouthy and long to say, would be a gathering place for everyone who likes to read. And because of that, I've spent all my time as a children's buyer really trying to focus on having a diverse section and having read diverse books, to be able to show them to people who, in a town that's overwhelmingly white, um, it's good to have access to that kind of literature, especially for children, so they can walk into the world knowing that there are people who don't look like them who can be the stars of their own stories.
I'm Gia. I'm currently an instructor of English in North Carolina. And I specialize in 19th century literature. And I say that because a lot of 19th century literature is written by white people. And for a variety of kind of economic and cultural reasons, it was very, very hard for writers of color. And I say writers of color as kind of meaning as giving it as broad a meaning as possible. Black writers, indigenous writers, writers who had immigrated from around the world. It was very, very hard for them to get published, and they often had to be sponsored or vouched for by a famous white author or a white critic. So most of what I study are white writers, but I've always tried to bring in other points of view and point out that whatever the kind of prevailing white perspective that I'm looking at is, that is not the only perspective, and it is not the most important perspective. It's just the kind of the loudest perspective. And I think it's really important to start kind of drowning out that loudness with other voices and other perspectives so that we can get a much clearer understanding of what it was actually like to exist in the 19th century and what it was actually like to read books in the 19th century and to read newspapers and magazines. Um,
Well, what do you have to talk about with regards to that? What books do you have in mind?
so when we started planning this video, I automatically wanted to go to the 19th century because obviously that's where my specialty lies, so I can talk about that literature a lot more fluidly. So one book that I think is really, really important for people to take a look at is Our Nig by Harriet E. Wilson. At this moment in time, Our Nig is considered the first novel written by a Black woman in America. We have not been able to find a novel that was published before Our Nig. Like a lot of novels written by Black women, especially in the 19th century, it is semi-autobiographical. It is about a young girl who was born free in New England, and it basically traces her absolutely horrific life, right? Just um, abuse and violence and poverty at every turn. And the reason why it was published was the author wanted to show that New England was no better than the South, right? Racism was still rampant. It wasn't like New England was this haven for um, freed Black slaves or Black people who were born free. So it's a hard read, but I think it's really, really important because it does a lot of important contextual work that we don't necessarily see, because a lot of the people who ended up getting published were slaves that managed to find their freedom in one way or another. So I think it's a really, really important text. But the book I'm actually going to recommend as my novel for Black History Month, I will admit it's not a particularly unusual one. I want to talk about Their Eyes Were Watching God. I think this is a book that comes up almost any time people start talking about fiction written by Black women. But I still think it is one of the most beautifully written books I've encountered in my life. There's a scene where a hurricane is moving in, and just the description of this kind of slow moving natural disaster and the ramifications of this natural disaster. It's still some of the most moving writing that I've ever encountered in my life. But more than that, it really manages to capture the experience of newly freed Black people in the South through Reconstruction and through the turn of the century. And I think that this is an era we hear about in our history classes. This is an era we read about in our history books. But I think that there is a kind of empathy gap there because we don't often hear those particular stories. We don't often hear about what happened to an individual, right? We often hear what happened to an entire group, and that can get very overwhelming and very difficult to understand. So I highly recommend Their Eyes Were Watching God because it drills down on that individual experience and what it was like to live through these eras. It is it's a very difficult text. The main character experiences several different very abusive relationships. Not necessarily a hopeful book. I think it's a book that's there to indict really the United States and what is happening to um, Black people in the wake of the Civil War. So I think it's an absolutely one of the most important books you can read. I think absolutely everybody should read it, but I think there's so much to be learned from a book like Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I think that it's a very accessible book. It's not kind of the impenetrable 19th century prose that can be associated with a lot of books. It's very, very readable. It's a very quick read. I think if you're going to reach for, well, obviously you have recommendations, so I can't exactly say what I was going to say, but if you're going to reach for any book, I think that Their Eyes Were Watching God is probably one of the 2 or 3 books you should reach for, because it really is just so important and so thoroughly captures a really, I mean, they're all pretty dark eras in American history, but a very dark era in American history that doesn't often get talked about for how dark it really was, I think.
Well, I think people tend to skip from, oh, the Civil War ended and now it's civil rights.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of the meat of why civil rights had to
Yeah.
happen,
Yeah.
Um, like you can't just go Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr. And I
Right.
feel like that's what a lot of people's education gave them.
Yes, I agree. I agree. And I think for all that Harlem Renaissance has really held up as an important literary era, I don't know that it's really put in the context that it needs to be put in, right? This was one of the first times where Black writers could actually get their words out there and have people actually read them, right? It was a just tremendous turning point in publishing history. And I think that the fact that Their Eyes Were Watching God is one of those books, and one of the books that made the Harlem Renaissance mainstream in that way, I think is really, really important.
And sort of piggybacking on the idea of turns in publishing history, I think we're at one of those turns, and I think that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years. I think that mostly led by children's books, young adult and children's books. There's been just a wonderful movement. We need diverse books. In fact, there's an organization of that name that promotes writers and books who tell diverse stories. And like a lot of movements, this was led by women of color. Um, and as a woman of color, it made me realize there isn't a lot of clear representation of a lot of types of Americans, especially in children's books. There's kind of a damning statistic going around about the number of children in picture books. Like there's animals in picture books, and there's white kids in picture books, and then there's black kids in picture books, and Asian kids in picture books, and Native American kids in picture books. And it's just this graph of there's more representation of animals, of cute animals in picture books than there are of a whole load of children. So are they gonna, they'll look at these books and they'll say, no one looks like me, nobody looks like me, why should I care? Like these stories aren't for me. And that's one part of why we need representation, for kids to look at books and say, that person looks like me, and that person has a story like mine, and thus I am important. I'm important enough for people to tell my story, and tell it to millions of people. And then there's the flip side of it, which is if see somebody else in literature and you say, oh, that person doesn't look like me, but they're important and they're allowed to have their own story. That fosters a large amount of empathy. And if you can do this to kids at a young age, both sides of the mirrors and windows equation, then you raise readers that are better people. And this is a theory that ever since I started buying for the kids section, I've really tried to focus on. But it also comes down to I need to consume these books so that I'm able to bring them to attention of people who might not have gotten them otherwise. So that's been part of my drive since I started doing that. So the past 6 or 7 years. And I'm always really happy when I get the occasional compliment, which is like, you guys always have this great diverse section. It's like, I worked for that. But I think I'm lucky in that I'm doing this at the turn of this publishing change. Because, when we were reading kids books and young adult books, first of all, there weren't that many young adult books as there are now. And secondly, they were white. They were white. There were a few things in fantasy books where like this is maybe coded Asian, or like there's a black person in this book, but they were predominantly white. And the change that's happened in the last like 20-25 years has been very impressive. Which means in some ways we can get down to perfecting and nitpicking the children's section. Like I hope everybody has heard of the book They Hate You Give. It came out 4 years ago now, 2017. And it opens with the main character, Star's best friend, being shot by a police officer in front of her. It's a startlingly good and amazing, it's an amazing book. It's an amazing story that really needed to be told. It really should be read by everyone who lives in America who hasn't had to feel that pain, or who is feeling that pain and needs to know that it's out there in the world. That's an important book. There's a book called Ghost Boys by Jewel Parker Rhodes, which is about a 12-year-old who's shot by a police officer, who meets Emmett Till's ghost on the streets of Chicago. And these are incredible and important books. They absolutely should exist, and no way take this wrong, please. They definitely should exist. But what I'm currently looking for in diverse books isn't just those stories. I want non-issue books, books that are about Black kids growing up, having a life, being Black, not just a character plopped down in the middle of a story who could be of any race, being Black, dealing with their life issues and the issues of living in America, but also, having a teen romance or fighting monsters or, doing something that isn't about re-examining and prodding old oppressive wounds. So there are a few of those out there in the world. There's a lot to be said about books that tell a historical story, but I think now we in the children's section can move a little bit beyond that, have stories that aren't just about the violence that have happened. Don't erase it, but maybe tell a story for a kid who wants to look ahead in the future. I think kids books are doing a pretty good job, which I'm proud of. Proud of my field.
I do want to give a slight shout out again to the Parker Inheritance, which I personally find to be a very important book. It's a little bit of an issue book, but a little bit less of an issue book, I think, than books that are tackling police brutality or aspects of Black Lives Matter, stuff like that.
I think it handles it well. It doesn't sweep under the carpet, but it's still a part of the plot. And yes. I think that's nice. I guess the point is that we're going to try and continue this theme throughout the month. And if you guys have any sort of thoughts or questions, do put them in the comments below. If you need a book, whichever book you might choose from our recommendations, you can always go to readersbooks.com. You can give us a call. It's 707-939-1779.
If you want more videos like this, we have 2 more videos planned for this month. We're going to talk about poetry. We're going to talk about nonfiction. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to our channel. So make sure you stay on top of everything that we're offering.
Bye.